Hi everyone, and welcome to flm204 here at Effects PhD. Now it's called a flame course, but what I'm targeting, as I said in the description, is that making this interesting for both flame and smoke artists alike, kind of an intermediate level. The root of this is effectively a remake of our expressions course. A lot of people have taken that in the past. We've got a ton of smoke editors who haven't even touched expressions, so we thought we'd do that. And basically, I'm going to cover that in about half the class. It's going to do some graphic design stuff, some math. It's going to be a lot of fun. And then on top of that, we're going to do some stuff like looking at the batch timeline, make it accessible to both flame and smoke artists alike. I think smoke artists aren't maybe used to using batch effects and their segment effects, and flame artists maybe aren't used to using the editing timeline. So we're going to kind of demystify that, as well as, of course, talk about red workflow and working with Avid and Final Cut and so forth, because, the red workflow changes on a monthly basis, and so what we want to do is give you the most recent information that we have regarding that. I mean, the jobs I've done here at Hootenanny have really involved a ton of red jobs already, so we've got a lot of real-world experience doing that, as well as just being owners of camera number 22. As far as expressions going, I know a lot of you have taken that course in the past, and we looked at, kind of a bunch of kind of obscure things, like just talking about maths of rotations and so forth, talking about the radius and center and giving you guys operations and how you do this with an expression and so forth. Things like this diameter, getting it to wheel around and so forth. If you take a look at the diameter, you can kind of actually see what's set up. As far as the length, and we talk about things from a mathematical standpoint as well, and the idea of just getting a circle to roll correctly, for instance, if you're doing graphics, but then just really nice day-to-day stuff, like actually not day-to-day stuff, but doing a whole entire spot actually. And what I did was I actually took this, and this is done entirely in flame and projectors, and I'm going to use textures and so forth in to show you in smoke. But I basically came up with this spot with a piece of 3D geometry and some still frames. And so let's take a look at it. Okay, now this was actually inspired by a demo that I saw at NAB and IBC. Some work, really nice work being done on the flame, and it kind of inspired me to do this. They did a spot with a Budweiser spot and did a lot of graphics, but what I did is I approached it a little bit differently from what they did. They had shot some stuff on a high-res camera and mapped this onto texture and flame and did all this stuff. Well, what we actually did, this is David, who is our newest employee here in Chicago. We actually shot a bottle on a turntable, and yeah, it's a little ghetto looking, but we ended up shooting this and shooting a bunch of high-res still frames of it. And the idea was I ended up using rotation of the bottle that I use with an axis to control layer slip, therefore getting this kind of nice animation that we ended up having for this little Heineken, or Pilsner Keltag, excuse me, that we did. And then a lot of depth of field tricks, some sparks, and things like that. So it was actually a lot of fun. So we're going to be spending a class taking a look at that later in the term as well. So again, a lot of fun. I'm even going to call up the old favorite here. Not spend a lot of time on it, but you've got this expression where I've actually got an axis somewhere here. An axis here that if I enter a count of, say, 500, it actually controls this odometer that we have going on here. So I've got a bunch of crazy expressions with that. So it's kind of fun to actually be able to do this. I'll provide this actually free with the class, and a lot of you took this in the past, have got it as well. But anyway, just some fun stuff to use as a what I like to say, something for the graphics toolbox you can hang on to and use when you need it. All right, so let's talk about expressions. And we're going to go ahead and just start out right in action. And I've just whipped up a little graphic here that's coming up next, Batch Smackdown. Again, I like doing a lot of stuff in 3D space. So when you do, all I'm doing now is everything static. I'm just moving the camera here at this point, so you get some nice effects. But again, you can just in designing graphics and stuff, this is going to be a really easy way to take a look at starting out with expressions. So generally what I might do in something like this, I'll just bung up something here really quickly. I've got auto key on. I'll go ahead and drag this off to the side. Say let's come in about 24 frames. Set this back to 0. Actually, I'll bring it over here. Okay, so we've got this coming in and landing. And then what we want to do is go ahead and say fade up our type. We'll just start there with an easy example. So what you ordinarily do, go ahead here and we'll go into batch, or into batch. Select the batch image, and what I'm going to do is, it's a good procedure to do is keep your stuff named. I don't name things a lot, but when I'm using expressions, I certainly do. So, I'm like, if you're like me, you've just got a ton of other stuff, ton of image and axes out and not named. But let's go ahead and take this, and I'll take my transparency and set it here. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and delete that key. I'm going to go ahead and go about 12 frames in here. I'm going to set this to 100, and then go forward another second or 24 frames to 36, and I'm going to do that. Now, ordinarily, if you weren't using expressions, what you would do is you go ahead and do the same thing with Smackdown. You know, go ahead, we'll set that to 100, jog over here, yada yada, and bring that down like that. So they're kind of fading up together, right? Ordinarily, that's what you do. Well, the key is, and the problem is with that, of course, is if you want to change the timing. Of course, we can always go in here, change our timing around. We'll go ahead and change to tracks view here. Go ahead and frame that channel and zoom out a little bit. The Z hotkey to do that. You know, we can go ahead and move both, move these around. Let's say if I wanted to just drag that, you do that, right? Okay, well, the key with expressions is, the idea is you want to do these actually at the same time. You want to simplify your life. I like to say that a lot of people think of expressions as power user features, and I guess they are. But I like to think of them as lazy features. Those of you who've taken my classes in the past know that. Just makes life easy, okay? So let's go ahead, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just say, at the most simplest level, the easiest level of doing this, what I want to do is I just want to copy all the attributes from this over to here. So I'll go ahead, and I'm going to say copy. Oh, undo. I'm sorry. You have to be in the animation copy, of course. So go ahead and say copy. Select Smackdown and hit link. And you can see now we've got this little E icon that means expression is attached to that, okay? And in this case, it's attached to the entire hierarchy. And if I hit the right bracket key, okay, that is this key right here. That one, except maybe not so angled on your keyboard. Okay, but it's up there just right above the enter button. Go back in here, animation. If I hit the right bracket key, you can actually take a look down here at the bottom, and it says batch. That's effectively the name of the node that you're linking from, okay? So it's taking all the properties from batch and applying it to Smackdown, okay? So if we go ahead here now, you can see that batch Smackdown. And now what's cool about this, if I go ahead and take this now, you can see that if I go ahead and do this transparency, I'm only adjusting batch, right? And it's adjusting Smackdown for me, okay? So you can see how useful that is, right? I mean, it's just really incredibly simple to do. And again, all we have to do now is if we do this, if I want to change my timing, I slide this, Smackdown is going to follow along with me, all right? So again, that's one of the big reasons I use expressions, is to just simplify things when I'm working, all right? So we're going to go ahead and say, I'm going to just go ahead and start my fading up here, and we're good to go. Okay, so that works out really well. That's kind of expressions at their simplest form, okay? So let's just go ahead and take a look at our desktop. And kind of how you refer to channels, okay? In this case, it wasn't incredibly obvious, but you refer to channels, it's just basically the node, in other words, image 1, axis 1, or in our case, batch, and you have .channel. By that I mean, for instance, you have image1.transparency, or if you're 3 layers in a hierarchy, axis1.position.y, right? So let's go ahead, and I'm going to go ahead and go back in here. Let's go back into action and take a look at that, okay? So let's go ahead and do that. And I'll show you what I mean. Let's go ahead and take this, and we'll open up batch now. And we're going to go ahead and say copy. And I'm only going to select the transparency here, all right? Copy. We'll go down to Smackdown. Now, one thing you have to do if you have an expression on the entire thing here, what you have to do is go ahead and reset the channel. So go ahead and do that. And if I go link, you can see that I've got an expression now just for transparency. And what's nice about that, if you separate things out like that, and you'll see, especially with axes, it becomes a little easier. You're only able to, basically I'm able to have different material offsets, various displacement and so forth, different between these two items. The only thing that's linked is transparency. And if I take a look at that function, you can see right here what I've got. It says batch.transparency. All right. Let's really quickly just show you what I mean to here with our axes. So I'll bring this axis up here and this axis up here. So if I take axis 13, and I'll go ahead and say I'm going to copy position X, copy. I'll go in axis 14, and I'll say position X and link. Okay, let's go ahead and right bracket. You see axis 13.position.x. Now you don't have to link things directly from one axis to the other. That's the thing you've got to remember. It's really, pretty easy to do. All you have to do is you could actually go ahead and say link here, and if you open that up, you've got axis 13.position.x driving both the x and y position. And then the last thing you can do, if I just tap on this and I hit that right bracket key, what I can do is I can just type it in myself. I can type in axis 13.position. Let's say z. All right. And if we look at that again, I've got that entered in. The other cool thing that you can do just when navigating, and I use it a lot because it's easy to get around, is just the up and down arrows. You'll go to the last things that you had entered in. Okay, so you can see I'm going through in any box. I was actually creating libraries here. So it's a quick way to actually have kind of a cut and paste buffer, for lack of a better word. So I'll go ahead and just enter that. Let's go ahead and just delete those because I just want to show you how that worked. All right, so what's missing here? Well, a lot of things actually, but shadows. All right, so let's say I want to add shadows to this batch smackdown here. How do we do that ordinarily? I'd never use shadow myself, okay? It's just something I wouldn't do. So I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add in black with the type again. So I'll take this black frame, and I'll go ahead and batch, and I'll go ahead and add this. And, I just started a new user because I'm using 2009 XP or Service Pack 2. You should always try. I'm a big fan of using especially the service packs. Maybe not the initial release, but the service packs. And actually now, I'm going to go ahead and do Smackdown. Sorry about that. What's happening is I've got auto image on. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. I don't use that. I go the old school way, not adding things on my own, right? Okay, so we've got this. Let's go ahead and now add these images in. And what I'm going to do is I'll lay near name. I'm going to lay it batch shad. And I'm going to name this smack shad. Actually, you know what? Let me just do that. I want to talk about this right now. If I hit dash shad, illegal characters will be replaced by underscores. Okay, let's talk about that for a second because I've actually got a handy graphic prepared for that. Basically, there's certain characters, and I'm sure you probably run into this when you're naming stuff, and maybe not exactly known why you're running into this. Because expressions use math and so forth, what we have is we have certain things that are unable to be used when you're typing in names, because you need to be able to add, subtract, multiply, and divide things when you're working with expressions. And you're also going to use parentheses as well, and we'll talk about that in a second here. So again, those are reserved. I had a subtract or a dash. I wasn't able to do that. It got replaced with the underscore. There's also some things that we'll talk about later when we start getting into expressions. These are reserved. These are comparisons. Less than, greater than, equal to, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to, and then these booleans, which are and, or, and not. Anyway, other function, not functions, but other things that are used when you're writing expressions. So again, that's why these things are reserved. We'll use them to create math and so forth. All right, so let's go ahead and go back into action. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'll parent the batch shadow behind batch and that behind that. I'm just going to set this, say, to z position of -5. And actually what I'm going to go ahead and do is I want these to be the same. So I might as well just go ahead and say, let's go into animation. I'm going to go ahead and say copy and link. Okay, and so now when I move both, oops, I'm touching smack down there. Let me go ahead and move this. If I go ahead and take this back, you can see I'm moving both of them. So let's go ahead and move this just back minus, say, 10. And then, let's say minus 20. Now we've got some Z buffer issues or Z issues here going on. So let's go ahead and go in our media layer, and I'm going to sort these in the right order. Okay, I'll put the smackdown shadow behind smackdown and the batch behind batch. I just so often just go ahead and end up doing things like doing that manually. You know, you have the Z sort button, but I end up, you know, you end up running into situations where it's just not working for you. And so I just go ahead and say, hey, you know what, I'm going to leave it and do it manually. So let's see. Let's talk about where these are. These are out in Z space at about 79. Okay, I've got these all centered out together. I don't want to do that because I got auto key turned on. Let's go ahead and go back here to frame 1. All right. So I've got the shadow here, and I'm actually going to move the shadow back so it's almost resting, you know, where you might expect it to back on the surface. So you will see that because it's actually going to disappear. Okay. All right, so let's do that. And you can see now that I actually need to move the smack down there. I'll move them both behind. All right. And so now that's actually going to have a nice look because it's going to look like this is kind of out in front here. It's casting a shadow, even though maybe my light direction is not quite perfect. But of course, we're going to want to do a nice Gaussian blur. Okay, and let's go ahead and got those multi-selected there, and so we'll do a 6 like that and like that. But again, we really don't want to do that, right? What we want to do is we want to go into our layer here, and let's go ahead and go back up into our layers. That was layer 9 and link it to 10. So we'll go to Media, Media 9. Let's go ahead and copy and go into layer 10 and link. Okay, so now when I modify 1 here, it's going to modify both of them. Okay, so let's just go ahead and we'll go ahead and do this like that. Okay. So that's a little too transparent. So what we want to do is kind of back off on that. And we also need it to fade in, right? Because right now they're not fading in. It's actually there the whole time. So what we need to do is have it kind of mimic what's happening in our type. As you guessed it, what we're going to want to do is link the transparency from this to this. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll go into our animation menu. And let's go ahead and say, just going to only link the transparency, okay? So let's go ahead and copy. Let's take this and move down here to the batch shadow and link. Okay, so now what we've got is we've got those kind of fading on together, so that works well. Now, what I like doing is I like using kind of cascading expressions for a case like this. Notice how I've got the batch set up, but what I can do now is I can just take the batch here and say copy this. Okay, since we know this is linked to this, we know those two will go together. So what I might as well do is I'm just going to go ahead and take this, copy this, and go into smack shadow and link the transparency here. All right, so that's looking pretty good. Now, what's not looking good, actually, in my feeling, is that it's too harsh. All right, what I'm going to want is I'm going to want this shadow here to be, say, more like 50. Okay, so you've got that nice soft shadow. But since my transparency is linked, you can see here, as it fades, it goes from transparency to 100 down to 0. So what we need to do is figure out some maths to get it to track so it ends up being 50. All right, so what you could do is, if you think about it, you'd think that 100 would be 50%. But in this case, when something is fully opaque in Flame, the transparency is 0, and half of 0 is 0. It's kind of opposite what you might think. So when your transparency is 100, well, that might be 50 if it was half that value, but that doesn't work the way things are. So what we need to do is do a little bit of math. What needs to happen is when transparency here is set up to 100, we need our shadow transparency to also be 100. But when the shadow transparency is, or when the main transparency is 0, we need our shadow transparency to be here at 50, or, even 25, but we're going to use 50. So what we need to do is that math. So let's talk first here about order of operations, because we're going to need to use that. We're going to use the parentheses. If we take a look at this function here, or this formula, basically you have 5 plus 100 divided by 2. Okay, and what happens when you're working in order of operations? It's going to do the dividing before it does the adding. Okay, so you're going to end up with 50, because 100 divided by 2 is 50, and then add the 5, ending up with 55. The way to get around this is we're going to enclose something in parentheses. And what happens is anything in parentheses gets processed first. Okay? It's the first thing that gets operated on. So we get 5 plus 100. So we're going to end up with is 105 divided by 2, which is 52.5. So why do we care about that in the least? Well, you're going to need to use parentheses when we're working with expressions. So what we're going to do is this is the transparency function that we end up with. The transparency function I'm going to enter is image.transparency for the item that I'm doing plus 100 divided by 2. So what happens is when our image transparency, as we showed, starts out at 100, our master one, the fill, we're going to say add 100. So we end up with 200 divided by 2, which equals 100. So our shadow transparency, this is our shadow, ends up being at 100. Well, let's take a look at it when image transparency is 0. You get 0 plus 100, so you end up with 100 divided by 2 equal to 50. That's exactly what we want, okay? So the image transparency is the image transparency of our main text, and this gets applied to our shadow. So let's go ahead and take a look at that now. Go back into action, and this is where you're going to have to get your hands dirty. And this is also why you'll see why I did that link from here to here. So let's go ahead to here. I'll go ahead and select this. And what I want to do is I want to take batch.transparency, okay? Because if we take a look up here, we've got batch.transparency, all right? So let's go ahead here. We'll say batch.transparency plus 100, okay? And close that in parentheses and divided by 2. Okay, that's what we had on our desktop, right? So go ahead and enter that in, and you can see how it works. You can actually see those things change automatically. And again, you get that idea of why I wanted to copy my, you know what? Did I enter that in on the wrong thing? No, I did. I was right. Okay. Sorry, I just had a mind meld there. So you can see why I linked this to here. That updated automatically. It propagated. Okay, so again, think about that when you're setting things up. So now I've got this coming in. I've got my batch smackdown, so that's looking pretty good. It works out quite smashingly for us, as they would say. All right, so that's a look at that. That's looking a bit nicer. Now, actually, before we continue, I want to talk about, for those of you who haven't done a lot of work in 2009 Extension 1. Now, 2009's been out for ages now. It's certainly not a new release for anybody. I'm not going to go over, tons of new features or anything like that. But what we want to do is let's go ahead and talk about a couple things about lighting, all right? I've got this light right here, and we all know lights in Flame, okay? I add this light, and really you don't see anything going on here. I've got this parented towards here, here, and here, all right? If I take it down to 0, you really see nothing going on. And let me just go ahead. I'm going to reset that light just so you can see it. You can see a little bit there. I don't know if you caught that. But I'll go ahead and bring this out. There you can see. And then spread down. There you can kind of see it there. I'll take the fall off. All right. So you get these really subtle things. You see that kind of moving in there? Well, what's really cool about the new version of Action is you can actually come in here and you want to swap our action resolution to 16-bit floating point. And those of you who are working that know it's been there for a while. We'll go ahead and apply that. And now all our processing within Action is done in floating point, okay? But you're still not really seeing anything. I'm not able to generate those overbrights, and that's because we have this clamp colors button down here at the bottom, all right? Right now what's happening is we're clamping our colors to the regular 0 to 100. If I turn this off, check this out. It's like, I guess it's like Spinal Tap. You can take this to 11. So we'll go ahead and take 100, and now we can bring this way up and see, you can see now I'm getting this highlight bloom now that we didn't have before. So now if I bring this down, you can see I can get these nice light passes that I was not able to do before. All right? That's really useful when you're working with 3D geometry or 3D text. I do a lot of 3D text in Action, and I like duplicating geometry and putting a thin border on the edge of thickness, and now I can just take them, really bloom those highlights on the edges. So again, I just thought I'd mention that while I was here. It's kind of a nice feature. And again, that's just set up at 88 right now. Actually, if we just go ahead and take the intensity, but you can take it all the way up to the point that obviously you start blowing things out. But again, that's again one of the really cool things about some of the newer releases here within in the Autodesk products. And this is true for anything that supports 16, anything like smoke or anything that might support that as well. So very nice. I just thought I'd show that to you guys. So now let's take a look really quickly at linking other things, like let's say blur to position. Let's say I want to have this coming up next as it comes in be blurred, fake motion blur, let's say. So what would you do for that? What we want to do, a good way of doing that might be to link in some way the position of coming up next, in other words, this animation that we've got going here, with blur. So let's just go ahead and do that just really quickly. And we'll go into animation and we'll do position X, right? Because that's what we want. So I'll go ahead and copy. And what layer is that? What layer was that? That was media layer 6. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to blur X and link. Okay. So what we end up having is we end up having this thing that goes from really blurry here at the beginning as it comes in down here. Well, that's because we're going values here. This has a value of 1359 going to minus 121. All right. And so then our blur ends up going here from, let's go take a look, from 200 down to 0. So what we need to do is we need to kind of link these things in a more reasonable way, and it involves, sometimes a little bit of thinking about the way you want to have things set up, okay? So let's go ahead and do this. Let's get this position. I'll go ahead and delete this keyframe, and I'm going to go ahead and delete this keyframe, and let's just go ahead and position our coming up next title where we want it to end, all right? This is our ending position, right? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to drop an axis in. If you hold shift down, I don't know if you know this, but shift will link the axis or drop it in automatically. So this is going to be, let's go ahead and say this is next move in. And then why did I do it this way? Well, that's because what I can do is I can come in here on frame 24. And what I can do is I can set a keyframe here as 0, all right? Because I know that's where I'm going to want this thing to end up, right? And then what I can do is I'm going to go ahead and move this over to the left like this. So I end up having something that goes from a number down to 0. Because what I want to end up here is I want this blur value to end up at 0 at this point, okay? So what we're going to do is 1540 to 0. So now let's go ahead and we'll do next move in, and we'll do our expression. And let's go ahead and enter this by hand. And this is going to be next move in dot position dot x. And we're kind of back to where we were. Okay, but we notice now here at the end, notice it was getting unblurry near the middle. We're across 0. Now at least when it comes to the end, we're seeing it unblur. Okay, but what I'm feeling is I'm feeling 200 is a bit too much, right? So let's use a little bit of math, and I'm just going to start playing around with it. A lot of the times I'm not doing stuff that's, rocket science. I'm just kind of trying things out. So let's go ahead and take this and say next move in, and let's just divide the value, say, by 5. Okay, so it's going to take the next move in position and divide that value by 5. So we're still getting 200 at the beginning. That's not what I want, okay? So let's go ahead and say, let's divide that by, say, 10. Okay, so now we've got a blur of 154 at the beginning. And so then as it comes in here, you can see it's a little gentler move in, right? We're not just having that big jump, because instead of, when this is right now 32.9 away, if we look at the media here on that layer, it's only the blur's 3.29. Okay, so it's just a way of nicely transitioning using math. All right, so that works out a lot better. Again, I'm linking two different items, and when you're doing that, you're generally going to want to have to do a little bit of math to make these things look reasonable or make sense or whatever. Okay, that's just kind of the nature of the beast, I guess, if you would. And what I've done here is made things just like really simply. Now imagine, let's say, again, what we want to do is we just want to go ahead now and I want to change the timing of when the next, coming up next comes in. So ordinarily what you'd have to do, you've got this stuff where you've got stuff blurred in, you've got stuff not linked, and we want this to, go ahead and have this start later, say at 25 frames. But see, I don't need to move my blur animation now. Since my blur animation is linked with an expression, it times right along with that, all right? And that's really the nice thing about it. And then once again, same thing here. If we take this batch, and since we got everything kind of linked together here, everything follows. Making 2 adjustments. Okay, I've got a bunch of stuff going on. Okay, not a bunch of stuff, but a considerable amount of stuff going on here. And it's working really well. All right, so I hope you can see kind of where the expressions kind of work for you in this kind of thing, especially when you're doing things. And, we're doing a little title design thing here, but, think about legal lines you might do on spots that you do all the time. Things like that. It just really simplifies your life, makes things really easy to use and really easy to change, actually. Yeah, we're going to be covering a lot of stuff later, like, I got crazy expressions with that odometer where it's just pages and pages, and, this could maybe scare the Jesus out of anybody, but anyway, it doesn't have to be that way. It can be really, really simple, and I really want you to take a look at that. And that's what we're going to be looking at when we dive back into expressions in a couple weeks after our look at the batch timeline next week. Before I sign off for this class, I just want to point out something that's available as a second download in your class, and that's this thing that we've been providing with our introductory smoke and flame courses, as well as even an intermediate flame course that kind of followed the 100 level flame course. And that's this thing from Smoke 101, which shows you how to maintain pixel purity when you're working in action. There are a lot of issues when you take a look at edges versus anti-aliasing here, and softness, motion blur, how to crank, does cranking up to 64 samples mean it's good? No, not always. How do you deal with keeping your images clean? Because you can actually really damage your imagery, making it a lot softer if you don't know what you're doing in action. And the reason I'm bringing this up now is because we'll be talking about this, because if you start stringing action steps together as part of segment effects, you can really soften your imagery. It's really important to know, especially with the DBE module, if you don't know what's hidden kind of beneath it. So that's why we did it in the smoke course, just to introduce people to what was going on and really help people make sure you get the nicest possible image, because some of the image processing, or a lot of the final image processing within Flame is done using the OpenGL graphics. And honestly, it's in need of a rewrite to make it kind of live up to the standards of some of the other things. But if you know what you're doing, you can maintain imagery, maintain your grain structure, and so forth. And that's why we provide this again to some of our introductory and intermediate level courses at FX PhD. And again, if you've seen this already, it's like a 20-minute thing that I did as a bonus. Go ahead and ignore it, whatever. But again, that's why we provide a second download and not the first. Well, that's it for this week. I'm really enjoying being part of a Flame course again. It's near and dear to my heart, and I really enjoy teaching courses at FX PhD. I get involved a lot, as I said, with maintenance and so forth. But again, loving this. If you have any questions, drop by the forums. We'll be sure to answer them and keep an eye out for them. And until next week, thanks for being part of FX PhD.